I'm using this podcast mostly as a placeholder because the things we have discussed thus far in this adaptation podcast series haven't been very sector specific. So there is the overall concept of making the infrastructure resilient to climate change, which is what we have mostly discussed, people and firms. But there are sectors that we can think of. Food, agriculture has to be made resilient and adapt to climate change impacts as well. Transportation, energy, health. So there are many ideas on specific adaptation approaches to these sectors for these sectors as well. I'm not going to cover all of them because I didn't find any good book or report addressing each of them. So I have taken some ideas from this book on food security and another paper. This is about combating climate change by adaptation for food security, which includes agriculture, but food sector in general. But we have discussed agriculture in terms of the emissions, the approaches to reducing emissions in drawdown course climate solution and geoengineering, increasing soil carbon uptake, and natural solutions or nature-based solutions which reduce emissions of soil carbon and help sequester additional carbon and so on. And there are ideas always around on tree-based agriculture or agroforestry, which can help literally enhance soil moisture retention, soil properties, carbon uptake, and nutrient dynamics, and so on and so forth, in addition to, of course, always increasing yields and increasing drought resilience, for example. Okay, so you can mix and match all those podcasts as you wish. In this series of podcasts on climate adaptation, I'm using this as an example of how to think about sector specific adaptations. And if I find later on some good literature on other sectors, adaptation for other sectors, I'll add them as I find them. Okay, so that'll happen in the future as we go along. So some very generic points here, and then we'll come back at the end and look at some ideas from synthetic and systems biology for fighting climate change, which will include genetically modified crops, but also GMO crops have had a role to play, as well as lots of controversies from the socioeconomic point of view as well. So all these are relevant for overall climate adaptation learning process, so you follow up as you find it necessary for your own interest. So generally speaking, how does food security get affected by climate change? Of course, we are increasing greenhouse gases, not only from fossil fuel use for industrial activities, transportation and buildings and so on, but also for agriculture itself and for food processing, food transportation, etc. That of course is causing climate change, which is causing impacts like sea level rise, high temperatures, extreme events, excess rain and drought, so wet and dry extremes. Sea level rise can cause problems for agriculture through salinization of groundwater, for example, in coastal regions. Of course, with irrigation, we are doing the same thing as well. So we'll leave it at this general level, and then we are talking about ecosystems, which are going to translate these directly or indirectly into agroecosystems, and these also affect directly and indirectly diseases, pests, land degradation. So for example, increased temperatures may favor a longer growing season by early arrival of spring, but they also reduce number of frost days and increase pest infestation problems and diseases. In general, warmer temperatures favor microbes to grow faster and in more abundance, and extreme rainfall can spread it and cause all sorts of problems as well, not only for agricultural ecosystems but human beings as well. Agroecosystems then include crops, plants, livestock, forest, aquatic species like freshwater and marine species, which affects productivity, which comes in through quality and quantity. We won't go into the details, but quantity is of course crop yield losses, but quality is that with warming, even if rainfall increases, micronutrient uptake is found to be reduced, so you may be getting grains, sometimes even more grains, but less nutritious grains. So food security also should include nutrition security in that sense, which affects price. So market demand, storage, and transportation are part of the climate change cascade into the food security issues as well. So prices will affect profit and income, livelihoods of producers and other livelihoods, especially the poor people. So food security, even there are indirect effects if bioenergy is pushed as a solution for climate change, as a mitigation option, then how does it affect food security for poor people and vulnerable people, low-income countries, and so on, through market demand and so on. So it's been argued for a long time that it's not the production of grains that's the problem, it's the distribution and access that's the problem. So access can be quality, quantity, and access can be physical and economic access as well. So lots of details there which include socioeconomics and not just natural sciences. So high temperature induced yield losses are well known as well, another schematic. So we are doing it at a very kind of brief schematic level. High temperatures affect root and flowers as well as leaves. So growth inhibition can happen, and flowers, pollen sterility and reproductive incompatibility can happen, and the pollinators themselves can get affected, but here we are talking about hormonal regulation. Reactive oxygen species, so membrane damage, stomatal behavior, CO2 limitations, and water loss. Actually, stomatal conductance is already argued to be affected. So if CO2 increases in the atmosphere, the stomata doesn't have to remain open as long, which means it's not losing as much water as it's stomata opens, it has brought water with hard work from the roots up to the leaves, and CO2 has to be captured for photosynthesis. So the idea is stomatal conductance is optimized for reducing evaporative loss while capturing enough CO2. So if CO2 is high and stomata closes quicker in a climate with high CO2, then water loss is reduced, and this is argued to produce CO2 fertilization and so on as well. Modification in leaf area, light harvesting capacity. So leaves have evolved to harvest light at a efficiency of 2 to 5%. So high temperatures can affect I mentioned CO2 here, but it's the high temperature we are discussing. But nonetheless, we'll look at C3 and C4 plants where CO2 and temperature can act together. So light harvesting capacity can be affected by high temperatures. Photosynthetic segments, rubisco inactivation. So rubisco is a very critical carrier for photosynthetic electrons, ions, and so on that goes into the reactions. Water and nutrient supply, photosynthesis, so assimilate supply to fruits, and fruit abortion. So fruit development is affected from both sides and from down this chain, which then affects the yields. Kind of a very schematic, but at least you can get a sense of how many pathways are involved in translating high temperature into yield loss or gain. It depends on how these things are affected, negative or positive, and what the net effect is as well, right? So as an example, rice production, so we went from very high level food security issue to a high temperature impact on crop yield as a general idea, and now we are looking at a particular crop. So crop production as data for the past and going into the future. We are looking at milled rice production in millions of tons here, and the years starting at around 1990 or so, or 95, going into the future to about 2035 or so. So rice production from 95 to 2010, and predicted increase in rate of production required from 2010 to 2035. So this is using future projections of estimated rice demand. So we are talking about current rice production in this dark green color, which you can see drops into the future here and has already dropped over some of the historic period. Estimated increased rice production required to meet the demand over 2010 to 2035 is estimated here, and potential current increase in production meets part of the demand, but there is a yield gap when you look at where the demand is expected to go. This includes many things like population growth, socioeconomic growth, per capita GDP increase, and so on, but one has to be careful because there are uncertainties in each of these projections. As Niels Bohr said, prediction is always difficult, especially if it's about the future, and these are not even predictions, they are projections where you have to make many assumptions about how population will change, how agricultural practices will change for rice, because there is sustained rice intensification practices as well that we will look at a little bit. Okay. Going deeper into photosynthetic processes, I'm just randomly taking figures from the book that I mentioned in the first slide. It is a long book. I've just based on my own subjective judgment, picked a few figures to make one or two podcasts on climate adaptation and, as I said in the latter part, genetic adaptation for dealing with climate impacts on agriculture and food security. Okay, so here comparisons of photosynthetic rate in this one. So that's from a paper. Yield in here, water use efficiency in C, and nitrogen use efficiency here, NUE, and this is the radiation use efficiency. Okay, so there is something called photosynthetically available radiation PAR. So solar irradiance comes in, there's all kinds of clouds and humidity and dust and this and that in the atmosphere, and then plants worry about the photosynthetically available radiation. As you know, they photosynthesize in certain bands of the electromagnetic spectrum from the sun, especially in the visible band. So then there are details about the chlorophyll abundance in the leaves, leaf area, water use, etc. Okay, we'll not go into those kinds of details. So CO2 assimilation rates in micromoles per meter squared per second, intracellular CO2 pressure microbars. So there are two types of plants that have evolved over time, as we will see in a minute. C3 are here in terms of how intracellular CO2 increases with CO2 assimilation rate, whereas C4 ramps up very quickly and saturates and remains flat in terms of assimilation rate as intercellular CO2 pressure increase, partial pressure increases. Standing dry weight at harvest in tons per hectare. So yield increased by 50% in C4, and C3 increases but not by as much. So C4 have actually they evolved earlier, but C3 is now much more of the species. If you look at all species of photosynthesizers, C3 is the dominant number of species, even though it evolved after C3. So who responds in which way to warming temperatures, increasing CO2s, increasing humidity, depends on how they have evolved. But basically you know that C3 and C4 correspond to the number of CO2 molecules involved in the photosynthetic process. So that has to do with how they evolved and why they evolved, different pathways, and how the efficiency of photosynthesis changes, etc. Evolution is always in response to environmental perturbations. Then you have to get into details about whether they are genetically different or same genetic material with phenotypic response. So just expression of genes is different, not the genetic DNA itself. Okay, water use efficiency. Water use efficiency in micromole CO2 per mole of water. Here are C3 plants, so their water use efficiency is lower. So C4 does better if you have higher humidity. Nitrogen use efficiency 2.5 times higher, and radiation use efficiency is 50% higher. So we are talking about comparisons. So here is C4, so that's maize and sorghum, and C3 are wheat and rice, which are here. So if you have, if I'm not being very clear in the details of what we mean by yield increase and the changes in WE, UE, NUE and RUE, don't worry about it. But the main point you would want to take from this is that there are crops, some of which are C4 like maize and sorghum, and there are some are C3 like wheat and rice. So if they are responding differently to climate change, then we have to worry about food security in this sense by better understanding their response, especially as you cross thresholds of their optimum growth in terms of light and temperature. Okay, so here is radiation use efficiency. At least remember that they are very different because they have evolved differently to do this. Moving to C4 photosynthesis versus C3 plants. This is a conceptual model of the main phases of C4 evolution, which is from this paper you can look up. So you have growing here, general precondition, for example, gene duplication, anatomical preconditioning like closed veins. I'm not being very detailed here, so you can go and read. So we had C3 plants doing this, and phase 3 we had an enhancement of bundle sheet organelles, so C3 like plants, photorespiratory CO2 pump glycine decarboxylase to BSC. So we will not even worry about such details. So C3, C4 mediated plants, then C4 like plants, and C4 plants, and optimization for C4 photosynthesis. So here is atmospheric partial pressure of CO2 over billions of years. So the scale is non-linear. So here is the solar system evolving at around 4.6, but at some point Rubisco appears 3.85 billion years ago or so, and CO2, which was very high, drops, and then there are some details. Oxygen appears and becomes abundant in the atmosphere. There are details there which I have discussed in the Earth's climate history course if you want to follow up. And then more recently, these are estimates and modeled quantities, so uncertainties can be high. Here is CO2, how it has varied in detail with some larger variations along the way with snowball Earth episodes, evolution of vascular plants, large-scale photosynthesis, various perturbations, mass extinctions, and so on and so forth. Okay, so during this process we have vascular plants which appeared around 300 million to 400 million years ago or so. They evolved, photosynthesizers presumably evolved in the ocean, then colonized land as sea levels changed, shelf areas changed, and so on and so forth. Maybe I should come back and do this in the next podcast. We will look at how some models are used to do estimates of climate impacts and how to project crop yields into the future, and what kind of adaptation measures can be taken. So it's about, again, translating climate projections and socioeconomic projections into agriculture, and going down into crop models and specific crops, crop diversification ideas, crop mix ideas, and so on as adaptation measures. Okay, so I hope this gives you an idea that Climate adaptation for agriculture is very critical and important, and it's not just infrastructure that we have to worry about. Okay.